Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I waited. The time. Okay. Good morning. If you would please turn with me to 2 Timothy, the second chapter. 2 Timothy, the second chapter. As we look this morning at a dually titled sermon, Pure. But if we had to subtitle it, we would call it A Great House. A Great House. Two things that don't necessarily sound like they go together, but they literally come out of the text of 2 Timothy. Why? Because on the one hand, we talked about consistent themes throughout 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Purity is one of those themes, and not in the sense that Marcus is your example of purity. Oh, it'd be ridiculous. I can't preach from that perspective. I am redeemed. And so ultimately, if I'm going to be able to do as we said in class, to look at these scriptures without the anxiety that comes from reading and being like, ooh, wait a minute, that's actually reading me, not vice versa. But I can look at the scripture and, God willing, be empowered and encouraged by what it tells me, no matter how harsh the words may seem. That I sometimes have to do what I do, and it's kind of a boring word study. Look at what the word purity really means, right? Because when I look at it at face value, it seems like it's just convicting and personally condemning, because I know my impurities, right? But then on the other hand, if these scriptures are to have hope, then maybe there's something in the way that the word is actually used that helps me understand that, as we've talked about before, God already sees where I'm at, and all he is trying to do is take me from where I am to where he knows. I'd really enjoy it a lot better. But see, sometimes the difficulty is letting go of the things I think I enjoy now to get to things that he will give me a greater and a more lasting peace in. Because I hate to let go, right? But sometimes letting go. We talked about it before. When we way back in the Psalms talked about that concept of the empty cup. A full cup can't receive any new information. So that's just head knowledge. But for me as a person, sometimes receiving something better requires dumping what's in my hand in order to be open to a greater stability. Look at it this way. I can get a lot of money going out there committing crime, right? But I can have a greater sense of stability if I let go of my urges to do dirt and just try to find a way that could let me have peace with Richard and keep my money and my freedom. And so that, in a lot of ways, is what we're looking at in that concept of purity. It's not so much having to be exposed and shown for what I really am, as much as it is a transition to a greater peace of mind. And in a lot of ways, of course, I always start out in one verse, we go somewhere else. Let's back up and look at context. 1 Timothy is where the first instance where I see this coming up in these three, what they call pastoral letters. Pastoral letters, why? Because as opposed to Paul writing to different churches, whether it's the first three that we talked about or the last four in were more or less his prison epistles, he's writing to individuals, Timothy and Titus, counseling as to how they should go about doing their work in order to have peace of mind in Paul's absence. See, because we talked about a week or two ago how Timothy was written to as, in a lot of ways, the second team. And as the second team, it didn't necessarily seem that he knew he was going to be put into this position this soon. But Paul is writing him to say, okay, whether or not you thought it was going to happen this soon, you're there now, and this is how you need to handle it. And Titus seems to be a very similar letter. And one of the themes that he talks about in each of these letters where he's counseling people to step up to responsibilities they didn't necessarily think they'd have this soon is purity, beginning in 1 Timothy chapter 1 at verse 5. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere face. We talked about that last week. Moving forward to 2 Timothy, where we were before. The reason for the whole concept of the great house is in verse 20. He's going to say, now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but of wood and clay, some for honorable use and some for dishonorable use. And in talking about that, he talks about, okay, understanding that there are two different types of vessels in terms of the distinction between the honorable and dishonorable vessels. How do you avoid being a dishonorable vessel? Verse 22. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. And please fast forward with me to the book of Titus. We're in warning Titus about his circumstance working in Crete. In verse 13, he begins, "This testimony is true." We should actually back up to 12 for context in Titus chapter 1. "One of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, 'Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. Therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in faith, not devoting themselves to Jewish myths and commands of people who turn away from the truth.'" Verse 15, "To the pure, all things are pure, but to the defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their minds and consciences are defiled." Verse 16, because this will connect back to where we end up in the great house in 2 Timothy. "They profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. They are detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good work." And here's the thing, it sounds like it is, and that is a condemnation passage. But in even a condemnation passage, we can draw out encouragement. Why? Because as Brother Don said, I think, as we've said it before, we all have those things in our lives for which we stand condemned. Otherwise, you don't really need to be here. You can be watching, it's not football season, you can be surfing the internet and be making a better use of your time if you don't need someone to, one, forgive you and then help you with the things you are struggling with right now. That's what we have in common, assembling here. So even in a passage like this that sounds really hostile, what's it talking about? What's the advantage in a passage like this? It's saying what? Ultimately, you want to be fit for every good work. Because Marcus said so? No, let's turn back to 2 Timothy. Because ultimately, when he's talking about that whole concept of a great house, the verse I left out, verse 21, after making that distinction between vessels for honorable use and dishonorable use, he'll say, "Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master, and ready for every good work." What's the importance there? What's so important there? Well, ultimately, when he's looking at that holy, useful, and ready distinction, for years, like I told you, there's so many of these passages I read through, and I was like, well, what's the difference there? It's like, okay, those are all good things. So I just put them in the good thing box and moved on. Never really taking the time to understand how they're each practically different things that are in accord with that concept of righteousness we talked about in class today and we touched on in the Psalms. Righteousness is more than me simply wanting to do the right thing. It's me measuring it out. Like if I go into a job interview, like we said, we went back in time to my interview here. And I was like, wow, this could really turn out to be a performance evaluation on spot, on the camera. Let's not go there, right? But in order to evaluate the concept of righteousness, we said we had some ideals. One of the reasons why I came here is because we hoped that there were some things that we shared in common as things we wanted to do that we could accomplish together. But the only way we could really measure that is beyond the interview, saying that we have these things in mind. Are we really working in the same direction? And when Don talked about this whole concept of, well, how do you measure that? We talked about, look, you all got workplaces. And you understand that there are people you can and cannot necessarily trust in your workplaces, whether it's just raising the kids or out in the place where we're having to deal with workplace drama. The thing you have to use is an objective measurement of how you are establishing or losing trust. And we said that's so important. Why? Because once we lose trust, whether it's in personal relationships or any working environment whatsoever, trust can be difficult to rebuild. We talked about the whole concept of a boss that micromanages. I can become that boss that micromanages if my trust has been violated, right? And I don't want to be that guy or that person. I want to be the kind of boss that can trust, give instructions, and let a person go. But it's a relationship that goes vice versa. If I start out as that micromanaging boss, then as an employee, I'm not all that confident that my judgment is going to be respected. And so I'm making every decision trying to guess what the boss wants in the minutia, as opposed to him simply or her simply giving me a directive and telling me, I trust you. Get it done. See, that accords a sense of freedom. And it goes back to what we talked about in the whole concept of Galatians. Not wanting to be under the old law would seem more comfortable. Why? Because we really like that whole concept of circumcision at an advanced age? No. But we like circumcision a whole lot more than what was behind door number 2, which was stoning and death and persecution for not being circumcised. And so the law represented in many ways micromanagement. And what Christ was trying to say, or what Paul was trying to say in Christ, is that the freedom that you receive, it comes at a cost. You're going to have to endure the persecution. Paul was stoned outside of Lystra, right? In many ways consistent with what he had helped do to Stephen. But that's the penalty, right? And so that's what this is saying in a lot of ways. There are some doors, where some things behind door number 2 that we don't want to go through. But they are what is required if we are going to have the freedom that comes from the boss that doesn't want to micromanage us, right? And so behind door number 2 is God. But he's saying behind door number 2 is my cross. And so the price of having the freedom of a boss that trusts you insofar as you are making your decisions guided by his principle, we said in class. One of the things Paul emphasizes to the Ephesians in chapter 5 is understand the will of the Lord. That's the key that unlocks the freedom. See, we talked about that whole illustration of a weeble. Who remembers? Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. We said that's all good if the weeble's planted in the right spot. See, if the weeble's planted in the right spot, it's an example of resilience. The enemy can slap me around. And I'll pop back up in the right place. And the only honor in that comes if I'm rooted in fertile ground. Oh, but we talked about Paul's example. When Paul was in his former life, he was still committed to God, but he had this thing. This is where purity comes in, a divided heart. And this is where it hit me this morning for an illustration. I was praying. Oh, I was being so holy. God, help me deliver the lesson this morning in a way that will please you. Cliche. Why? Because I don't want to look bad. Let's be honest, right? I didn't have the conclusion all tight. I didn't have a bow on it. It had a conclusion that I came up with Friday after I talked to John. We chatted for a while, but this didn't seem to be the right one. So I was praying, God, keep me from looking foolish in front of the people this morning. That's not a pure heart. That's me just not wanting to look bad. See, a pure heart is me wanting to bless the people because the people have a life to lead. And we've talked about it before. The things they hear this morning can hopefully help them endure through their week if it's done right. And so when I'm looking for an example of a pure heart, it hit me this morning. That's it. Sometimes a divided heart creeps up on me when I think I'm doing the right thing. And ultimately, that's what he's talking about when he's saying, look, when you have to steer away from some things, even when we have our intentions set in the right place, weebles. Sometimes we can be in the wrong place. And just as that mentor that I told you about who talked about, look, if we drove a car and expected it just to stay, not a Tesla, on the road in the right path as we expected without hands on the steering wheel, we'd say that's absolutely ridiculous. We know that driving is a constant course correcting procedure, but we don't look at our discipleship that way. And he says, until we get into the mindset that as weebles, we have to constantly make sure that we are in righteousness, not simply wanting to do the right thing, as we would say it in a job interview, but we are constantly correcting our own course. Why? Because what's one of the benefits of not being micromanaged? That you got the freedom to show up when you want, do what you want, and do all kinds of things that can either build trust or break it. And that freedom comes with much responsibility. And so here's the thing. If nobody, like we said, oh, wow, this could turn into an impromptu performance eval a year and a few months in. Hopefully that performance eval, impromptu or not, looks a lot better if every day I'm evaluating whether or not I did what I needed to do. And sometimes on Sundays, I get a progress check. I can look in the eyes and be like, okay, maybe not this Sunday, right? But beyond whether or not folks are staying awake, if I can see measured growth, not only in myself, because one thing for me to, oh, I think I'm doing great, God. It's a team sport, right? And we talk about it all the time. One of the reasons why we see these players hopping from team to team is they're trying to find a winner, right? And sometimes that's the shame that comes with it. That's why I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I was going to say Steph. I'm not going to do it. I didn't say it. Okay, I did. But that's why Steph doesn't have to hop. Watch, he'll be in another team next year. I'm not going to say it. We'll just say there are players who try to find the right situation over and over and over. We're going to use Michael Jordan. And then we'll use Michael Jordan as one who didn't have to, right? Because I don't want to jinx my favorite. Anyway, bottom line is no matter how many points I score, we've talked about it before, on a losing team, it just don't feel right. And so I can self-evaluate and say, I'm doing pretty well, but if the team is not actually growing, we don't have any objective signs of growth, what's it worth, right? because I not only have to deal with the performance evaluation from, like when we're talking about one of the things he's doing in each of these letters is the standards of leadership. One of the standards of leadership is how's that person received in the community, right? Because that affects everything. How am I received in the community? That's one of my burdens, right? Is ultimately after I get through preaching, I am concerned about the image that I'm projecting. That keeps me up at night. Okay, not literally losing sleep, but figuratively, right? I'm concerned about that because I can erase all of this, no matter how well it goes, with the wrong image. And that's one of the things I personally try to overcome, right? We all got our crosses because it doesn't matter how good it looks if the whole package is flawed in one or many ways. And so what he's talking about here is the kind of commitment that says, look, beyond whatever it is, we talked about it before, that I do well, I got things I need to work on. Why? Because as I started to say but didn't finish, that whole distinction between holy, useful, and ready for every good work, in many ways, I think, looks like this. Holy is one thing, like we said, that's me in the job interview, trying to be impressive, making sure that hopefully we have our minds set on the same way. Useful is different. It's like we talked about. You're on the farm. You are doing work. You got tools, whether it's fixing a shed, a tractor, or whatever. Take the imagery. I'm just using that because I had to be a farmhand for a minute, right? And I knew what it was like doing work with tools that weren't so good as opposed to tools that were ready, right? If there are tools that aren't sharpened, that aren't taken care of, I got extra time I got to invest in taking care of tools so I can just get to work as opposed to just getting up, getting to work, and hopefully being as efficient as I can. Understand what he's saying here. There's a difference between being holy and being useful. See, being useful is making sure I am in the proper condition for him to use me. It's that maintenance. It's that self-evaluation. It's in between the times when people are checking up on me. It's checking up on myself to make sure that I am useful for, once again, his purpose, the thing that he conditioned, or Paul encouraged the Ephesians to be careful of, making sure you understand his will. And so one of the reasons why understanding his will is so important is not only is it helping me as a rebel to make sure I'm in the right place, it's making sure that I am sharpened for when he calls. What's one of when we talked about the whole concept of second team, why when I looked at the second team of that basketball team, seeing how happy they were said a lot to me. When you see people who are in a mindset who, even though they're on the bench, they're not starting. You don't think each one of those guys was starting on their high school team somewhere? You don't think their ambition isn't to start again? When you see people who are used to success, who can fix themselves in a position where they're staying ready. That's why the sixth man of the year is such a huge award in some circles, right? When's the last time you've seen a basketball team, win with only their starting five? A football team win with only their starting 11? When's the last time you've seen people who are engaged in drama or debate or any of the activities you'd engage in at school who do well without some form of practice? And in each of those engagements where you have a team effort, whether it's a sport or something else, somebody has to help you run lines. Somebody has to help you be sharp and ready for when you get that call, right? Because ultimately, it's not always your moment. But in helping others, that's what we talked about. To the degree that Timothy was diligent in helping Paul, when he was forced into the scene, he was actually helping himself. Look at it from this perspective. There were two great prophets in Israel, back to back, Elijah and Elisha. I always used to assume, well, of course the mantle is going to fall to Elisha. He was the servant. Who else would it fall to? But if you think down the line, who was Elisha's servant? Exactly. Kind of hard to think of his name because it doesn't just naturally progress. His name was Gehazi, and we know about him because he ended up getting leprosy. And why did he get leprosy? Because even though Elisha was faithful in his service to Elijah and thus was able to take his mantle and get a double portion of his spirit for his obedience, Gehazi was like, hey, boss, we're doing some pretty cool stuff, but we're not getting paid for it. I don't know if the math is right over where you grew up, but where I grew up, that's a rich guy that's walking away with a lot of money that he doesn't care about because he no longer has leprosy. And so after they got through healing Naaman, Gehazi cooked up a scheme to go get some cash and ultimately ended up with the leprosy that was removed from Naaman. It's not a birthright, right? It doesn't naturally fall into place. That's what I used to think it was. Why don't I know about Elisha's servant, but I don't, because Elisha did not make him, because Gehazi did not make himself useful for the purpose when he was called. Why? Because he was distracted by a divided heart. Can I condemn Gehazi? Sure I can. But would it be hypocritical? Probably would. Why? Because on my prayer this morning, God, let me decipher it. Help me look good in front of the church today. Right? Is that so different from what Gehazi wanted? It's just a different form. I wanted something for me. Gehazi wanted money for his pockets. Same problem, different manifestation. Two weebles in the wrong spot with the wrong mindset. Me thinking I'm holy, and I can tell you the story of Gehazi right off the bat, but it didn't come to mind because it's so much easier to see it in Gehazi than it is to see it in me, right? And so that's it. That's how subtle it is. Why? Because here's where it really catches up with me, and this is where I think the subtlety really is. Ready for every good work. You ready for every good work? Every's a big word. Are you really ready for every good work? Okay, hey, I guess we're going to go, and we're going to get some plane tickets, and we're going to go to Ukraine. You want to go? Let's go to Ukraine. You ready for every good work? There are no good works that we can do in Ukraine right now? What about, we talked about it before, like I was all eager to go to Malawi. Africa for beginners. And let's go to North Africa. Just a little further north, let's go to Iraq. How's the preaching going where ISIS is stirred up right now? Every good work, there's no good works you can do there? Okay, so that word every is big. And so what he is saying is really, if that's the kind of call he's legitimately making on your life, and it's not like we're going to get a phone call from God like we said, but am I in peaceful times conditioning myself to say that I'm really ready to go wherever he is asking me to go? We got a hand raised. We don't usually take questions during sermon, but go ahead. We got a question.
No, I have a question. I was just going to say, but if we were called to go to Iraq,
Yeah.
except one thing, that you could be killed.
Oh, well, of course. That's the thing, yeah.
It's Christianity's outlawed there.
That's the example. Thank you for clarifying. I just speak it from, because they've all heard me use this. How many times have I used that example, Iraq? Probably 5. Anyway, with that, I just don't tell the whole story all over again, but thank you for clarifying, because yes, I use Iraq because that's the place where you can go get killed right away. When I originally told the story, it was one of the reasons why Malawi was an easier mission field, because it was Africa for beginners. Whereas I knew if I went to go minister in Iraq, it might last a week. You might want to hold me for ransom, but y'all wouldn't pay very much for me, would you? I didn't think so, right? So it probably just lasts about a week. So with that, understanding, yes, the consequences are much more severe. And so that's a part of the every good work. It's a big world. And it's not easy to minister in the same place. And so when he's saying that, that's literally what he's talking about. And is he just kind of just writing, once again, things for our consideration? No, he's writing this many ways. He can't be there. That's why he's writing Timothy and Titus, because he's locked up. And his hope, his anticipation is he's going to live through it. Does he know? No, not for sure, even though he thinks he will. And so this is not a man who is writing from his office space, right? He's not writing from the church basement. What's my sermon going to be about this week? No, he's writing from jail. This word, every good work. And so that's what he's talking about, actually being prepared for. And that's why I can always, it's like we have our goals and aims professionally and personally. This is what I would like to be, right? You typically set your goals higher than your current reality. That's a lot of ways what he's doing. See, that's Paul's present reality. But he's saying that needs to be everyone's. Why? He's not talking about just his circumstance. He's saying in a great house. That's the context. He's talking about Timothy. This is what you look at in that group, and this is what you try to encourage them to aspire to. It's not simply being ready for the works I like to do. It's being ready for everything he might open, every door he might open. Once again, door number 2. Remember the movie, can't give it a great reference. It's not a Christian movie. Not one we play in the building. It by Stephen King. If y'all remember the part, one of the consistent parts in It were the 3 doors. And it was scary, really scary, and not scary at all. Do you think any one of those doors really had something that wasn't scary behind it? No, thank you. You know, they were all terrifying. And so that's in a lot of ways what it is. The only difference between the 3 doors in this life is whether or not you start off with, oh, that door looks nice, only to realize that there's a minefield maybe 100 yards down that pretty path, right? or whether it just shows you right away, this is really what you're looking at. And we were talking about fishing and how the deception was the common theme that tied our discussion in 1 Thessalonians to the Revelation to 1 John, how it talked about a man of lawlessness connected to a beast that was coming in the image of Satan. And then in 1 John talking about the Antichrist, who was simply the culmination of many Antichrists. The one thing they had all in common was deception. And our metaphor was fishing, right? That fish, when you're going fishing, if you're doing the right job, thinks they're going to eat. That's the lure. Hey, gonna come over this worm, right? But the reality is the fish is being lured by its appetite onto your plate if you're having a good day, right? And so that is the fundamental principle behind fishing. We just look at it as fishing. But fishing typically, unless you're using a net, if you're using a rod and reel, it's premised on deception. It's like, understand what you're doing, what Satan is doing for us. Even if door number 1 or 2 looks great, that's only a lure. And sometimes one of the reasons why it can be so difficult, that whole concept of tough love, it's easier for me to give tough love than it is to receive it. Why is that? Because, right? Because on the receiving end, there's some things I don't want to hear, right? On the receiving end, there's some things that are challenging me to change. On the receiving end is me being challenged to get beyond my natural reaction. Like we talked about gag response. You'd be like, no. To embrace whether or not the thing that I'm hearing is actually true. And here's the thing. It's easier for me. We've talked about the whole concept of 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. Miss Laura said it is easier to forgive, to endure, to be patient, to believe when you love the person you're asked to do that or go that extra mile for. Oh, but let it be somebody I don't like so good. Let God deliver me advice, right? Through somebody I don't like so good. And that's a challenge. But that's what we talked about. There are times when God is delivering the message through folks that, that's why it's so important to keep an open mind. Because he's talking about here in a great house. Let's go back to the very beginning. Now in a great house, there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. I always used to look at the gold and silver as good and the wood and clay as bad. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that at all. There are just different types of vessels, right? Would I necessarily want gold and silver to hammer my house? How's a gold-handled hammer going to hold up on nailing my roof? Yeah, no, it's going to bend up, right? Unless it's mixed with a more durable metal. And so wood is sturdy. It has a purpose. And the house don't get built really well unless you have wood and clay. Why? I could drink out of gold vessels. That's awesome, but clay is just more practical. I got other things I need to do with my money. Now, this is where it gets to the distinction between honorable and dishonorable. Some are honorable and some are dishonorable. But here's where the hope lies in all of these things. Is it just that we label certain things as honorable, dishonorable, and move on because God is going to come back and sort them out? No. He says, when I find myself praying those prayers, you simply want to have me looking good in front of the congregation as opposed to really concerned for the good of the congregation. This is my way back. If we look down for it, he says, verse 21, as we already read. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself of what is dishonorable. Marcus, if you can identify what's going wrong in your prayer and your mentality, and you can say, Lord, I really want to pray for a higher purpose, then this is how you get it done. Verse 25, let's skip down to verse 25. Verse 24. The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome. Why? Because the more I quarrel, the less they're paying attention to what God is actually saying. But kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. So that fish metaphor ain't just for fishing. It's literally what Paul is talking about. Satan, the enemy, has set a snare, and the way out is completely counterintuitive to what I thought the way out would be. See, I thought the way out would be me simply waking up and coming to my senses. But he's saying there are some things that I have to have God to essentially open my eyes to. Oh, wait, did Paul have that experience? Did he think his way out of his Pharisaical roots? No, he had his Damascus Road experience. And sometimes I used to look and be like, wait a minute, I never had a bright light experience to get me out of any of my troubles, right? That's not fair. Why did he get one? Oh, but all the prayers that I forget that he's answered, right? that were basically my Damascus Road experience. But once he delivers me from it, I'm just like, oh, thanks, God. Back to whatever I wanted to do, right? Never, as a weeble, fully getting myself back into the light, just appreciating the fact that he took care of me in the moment. Never rooting myself into a place where there is actual glory to being resilient. See, the alternative is if I never get up from my Damascus Road experience and move into the place where there is actual forgiveness and cleansing and prosperity in God, is I will still get there and be like, God redeemed me. I'm in the wrong spot. And I'm staying exactly where I am, rooted in the wrong place, just waiting for the next tragedy to come forward, right? To make sure that Marcus, I would give you all some of my life's list of Damascus moments. But you got your own, right? Half of mine deal with sports anyway. Y'all are tired. Anyway, so no more sports analogies. But just take maybe some time this week. If we're talking about a practical takeaway from this sermon, even if you don't believe it's been fair, because Peter got a Damascus Road, Paul got a Damascus Road experience, but I didn't. Ask God to show you the different things that he's delivered you from, just the ones you recognize that you ultimately have forgotten because he's been so good. And ask him, where am I now in relationship to where you want me to be? Because I can't think my way out of this, right? Ultimately, the progression, look, once again, it was one of those progressions I overlooked. Repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth. It's only after I have changed my attitude toward God is asking me to do. That's why that whole every good work thing is so important. To the degree I've narrowed my perspective to only the works that I'm willing to do, I'm still not ready to be where he needs me to be. Why? Because I've narrowed the field. And there are some things that he's asking me to open myself up to that my mind can't comprehend until I have let go, once again, emptied my hand or my cup of all the expectations I had for where I would be at this age. Wow. I'm going to go back and tell you what my 5-year plan was out of college, out of grad school. A little different from where I'm at now. And so in order to understand, right, people ask me, you like what you did before more than what you do now? I was like, actually, what I did before was less stressful, but it was outside of my purpose. And so I never, ever had the sense of peace that I have now, regardless of the level of stress. That's what the advantage of being in your purpose is it allows you to take a greater level of stress regardless of the circumstance. Okay, now I say that, and something will happen this week, and then, yeah, I need your prayer, but I say that every week, but it's real. But ultimately, it is true. It's impossible to replace the peace that you have behind door number 2 as long as God is the one who has opened door number 2. Door number 1 may look peaceful, but there is no enduring sense of peace living outside of your purpose. And that's what he's talking about. I need you to let go of your expectations of what a good work is so I can bring you into a place where you will genuinely have enduring and lasting peace that won't get you locked up, right? And even beyond, right? And so with that, he says, and that they may, in verse 26, come to their senses and escape. I thought come to their senses would have been in conjunction with the truth. No, there is a recognition of the truth that precedes coming to their senses or coming to our senses. And so after I've gotten up, I realized that my heart was in the wrong place, praying that prayer for a good sermon. I've opened my eyes to really what's more important. There are many people who have many needs that I can't see, and God really needs to open my eyes to say words that help them not only get through their week, because survival is one thing, we've talked about it before, but you really want to get to a point where we're actually thriving. They can help put people on a platform to thrive. Then I'm going to need God for that purpose, not just to sound good for a Sunday morning. So with that, ultimately, you got your own specific challenges. Mine are unique to me. But the one thing that this passage from Paul to Timothy is talking about is that whole concept of purity. It's not just, like we talked about, that concept of righteousness, just doing right stuff. It is making sure that not only is my mind rooted in the breadth of what God is trying to do, and breadth meaning the wideness, because that's a lot of what Paul says when he's writing to the Ephesians, and he's talking about, my prayer for you is that you can understand exactly how huge a sea of opportunity God is willing to open up, right? And once you are able to be open to exactly what he's trying to do, that you, just as it says here, you not only keep yourself sharp and useful, but you're ready to go everywhere in that world of opportunities that God is opening up. And so that is my encouragement for you, that as you take a look back maybe and pray for God to open your eyes about some Damascus moments that he's given you, things he's delivered you through, that you ask him to show you, am I where I need to be in understanding how broad a scope you have for the days ahead for me, so that I don't have to look back like Marcus and his buddies 5-10 years after graduation, shifting gears completely, because there's no problem in shifting gears, right? Because the things that I did in those 5 to 10 years before I actually shifted gears into my purpose helped prepare me for my purpose. See, there's sometimes when our young men from college is back now, you don't have to be pressed or stressed. Like, you have guidance counselors. What do you want to do with your life? What are you going to do after? I catch myself sometimes playing basketball with the kids on the court, the ones that are graduating. Where are you going after? I guess, kids, don't ask them that. Don't ask them, right? Because they don't always have jobs right after, right? Don't stress that. If you got one, great. Boom. If not, you'll find it. But ultimately, making sure that God is woven into the decision-making process so he can open your eyes to all the opportunities that may go even beyond what it is that you thought for yourself, can help you have a lasting peace that starts now, as opposed to when you maybe find it 5 or 10 years down the road. No shame in that, because it took some of us 12 or 20. Me, it was closer to 20. So, with that. I kind of pretended a conclusion about 20 minutes ago, right? And 20 minutes later, I'm still trying to wrap up. My prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we open our hearts to see all the opportunities that God has available for us, no matter how frightening the obstacles behind door number 2. I think that is where purity lies, is in really being open to all the scary options even that God has before us.